Good afternoon. I'm Martin Maron from the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and I'm convener of the British Art Network, which is supporting and hosting today's event. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Professor Paul Goodwin, who we invited to develop a programme exploring critical questions in British art curating. The result, Genealogies of Black Curating in Britain, continues with today's roundtable. This is the third of 3 roundtables, but the programme continues with commissioned films and interviews that are going to be released later in the year. The British Art Network is a professional network that aims to connect curators and create time and space for critical exchange and debate. It is supported by the Paul Mellon Centre, Tate and the Arts Council of England. If you have questions about the network or any of the organisations associated with today's event, do provide your email address and a representative will respond to you after the event. Right now, though, I am delighted to hand over to Paul.
Thanks to Martin and all the team at the British Art Network and Paul Mellon and Centre, and also to Rahila Haq for support in this programme. Before I introduce this fantastic panel today, and we're just having a great warm-up session before we join today, I wanted to briefly sort of reiterate the purpose of the Genealogies of Black Curating project, so that in order to help shape and frame today's session. So if Black art is now a relatively established category in British art, at least in terms of art historical recognition, how can we then account for Black curating? Indeed, what is Black curating and how did it emerge in Britain? This project seeks to address this by investigating the emergence, strategies and agency of Black curatorial voices and practices in Britain over the past 40 years. In framing this conference and series of panels, I've argued that the term itself, Black curating, is a contradiction in terms, especially if we consider the history of display and exhibitions in the West, the so-called exhibitionary complex, where Black and brown people have historically been positioned as objects to be displayed and looked at, and their common humanity often denied. I find myself asking, to what extent then has Black curating been an attempt to push back against and unravel this conundrum and contradiction? To what extent has Black curating used or even co-opted the apparatus of the exhibitionary complex and turned it against itself to eke out alternative stories and histories of Black life and Black art that have been suppressed by that same exhibitionary complex? Genealogies of Black Curating investigates what I want to call the Black exhibitionary impulse. By this, I mean that the huge diversity of practices that Black and brown curators have engaged in, and in many cases pioneered, has effectively formed a new paradigm in the history of curating in Britain that until recently has been completely unrecognized and ignored. This Black exhibitionary impulse includes, of course, the traditional activities around the staging exhibitions, but extends far beyond this to encompass the creation of archives and publications, the building and linking of activism and community, the engagement with transnational, international and diasporic perspectives, and also the giving voice to subaltern, suppressed and urgent voices from Black and Asian women, LGBTQ plus communities, faith and spiritual communities, and many more. For good years now, there's been a huge amount of writing, research, and exhibitions that have addressed the so-called expanded field of contemporary art, the role of artists and curators in it, and the institutional and non-institutional critiques that this expanded field has supposedly engendered. Art theorist Eric Rogoff has argued that the dominant transdisciplinarity of the expanded field of art and cultural productions entailed equal amounts of researching, investigating, inventing archives in which we can read in more contemporary ways, finding new formats, self-instituting, educating, organizing, sharing, etc. I want to contend that this transdisciplinarity and multiplicity of modes of curatorial agency and research has been embodied by and embedded in the practices of Black and Asian artists and curators since at least the 1980s and 1990s, necessitated by the desire and political will to reconfigure and invent new forms of exhibition practice in the context of the racism, exclusion, and obstruction, indeed violence, that they were confronted with in the art world. The task of investigating and understanding the genealogies of this Black exhibitionary impulse, I think, requires us to go beyond the narrow focus on exhibition making, implied by the term curating, and explore the terrain of what has been called the curatorial practices in the expanded field of cultural production. It will equally require us, in my opinion, to go much further and deeper than many of the limited and narrow understandings of Black art. Over the past few years in my research and curatorial practice, I've increasingly become interested in what might be termed the edges and fringes of Black art, the disciplinary and institutional norms deployed to sustain and promote the discursive space of Black art, for me, are actually open to question. Questions need to be asked around the kinds of knowledge that the category of Black art sustains, and who benefits and loses from it, its exclusions, its relation to wider institutional structures, and dominant artistic paradigms such as modernism, etc. So as the clamor for Black art to be recognized and canonized as truly and authentically modern and deserving of the place in the institution grows louder, I actually find myself drawn to dissident and submerged, even dangerous and subversive understandings of art and precarious assemblages of practices that might challenge what we understand as Black art, or even art full stop. I'm drawn to the edges and nether regions of Black art and art more generally because I'm curious to see if more radical forms of practice and knowledge production about the world, and not just about Blackness, can be discerned and put to use. I'm interested in giving a platform to other less well-known, hidden or submerged narratives in my curatorial practice about aesthetic practices and strategies within the fields designated or even legislated as Black art. In other words, alternative genealogies of practice that are less tied to institutional norms and the dominance of and fascination with objects that often come to dominate in mainstream circles. So that's my introductory spiel done. Today, we've got an absolutely amazing panel of practitioners, thinkers, and activists that I think can really help us to shed light on recent contexts for understanding Black and Asian curatorial practices in this expanded field. Curatorial collectives, archival practices, independent publishing, and cultural activism are arguably transforming notions of the curatorial and Blackness, producing novel and sometimes conflicting articulations. The key question that we want to address today is, how are these practices building on earlier efforts to make space for radical alternatives to the exhibitionary complex in Britain? That's the question that we're looking at. So our speakers. Our first speaker is Ajamu, and you can see the biographies of today's speakers in the text. So Ajamu is a darkroom and fine art photographer and archivist with over 25 years of experience in exhibiting in museums, galleries, and alternative spaces worldwide. Ajamu is also a radical sex activist, independent scholar, and co-founder of the award-winning Ruckus, the Black LGBTQ archive. His work includes portraits and self-portraits, which unapologetically celebrate Black queer bodies, the erotic senses, desire, and pleasure as activism. He's also a leading specialist in Black LGBTQ history, heritage, and queer cultural memory in the UK. And I'll also add that he's a PhD researcher at the Royal College of Art. Sophia Niazi is a lecturer, artist, and member of One of My Kind, Artist Collective. As part of she currently runs a community risograph print workshop, Rabbits Road Press in Newham. In her personal work, she's currently researching and producing work exploring the visual culture of the housing market. She regularly leads workshops and delivers talks about her work in community, gallery, and academic settings. Huda Khaire is an independent researcher and artist with a background in public international law. Her practice focuses on the position of Black people globally and has shared work at Tate Exchange, Tate Modern and Uncommon Space at Tate Britain, Print Room Rotterdam, and Somerset House, Chisenhale, Whitechapel, and DIY Cultures. Huda is part of the Black feminist artist collective Thicker Black Lines, as well as an associate of Numbi Arts and Zine. In addition, Huda is a founding member of the Somali Museum UK, super exciting initiative. Raju Rage is proactive about using art, education, and activism to forge creative survival. Born in Kenya, raised in London, and living and working beyond, they explore the spaces and relationships between disconnected bodies, theory and practice, text and the body, and aesthetics and political substance. Their current interests are around sustainability, economies, care, and resistance. They are a member of Collective Creativity, a hugely influential arts collective, and are a creative director and independent scholar with interest in radical pedagogy. Raju has a their story in activism, self and collective organized queer, transgender, people of color movements and creative projects in London and beyond, from which their politics and works draw on and from. And Raju is also trained as a pastry chef and baker, works in several community kitchens and has been part of a bakers collective, which we're assured has actually been really tasty and delicious. So today, in terms of the format today, each speaker will speak for approximately 10 minutes or so. We'll have a short 10-minute break, roughly around 2:55, and followed by a conversation between the panelists and myself that I'll moderate. And then the last 15 or 20 minutes will be for questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function and the chat function to leave your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to ask our first speaker, Ajamu, to grace us with his wisdom. Thank you, Ajamu.
Thank you, Paul, and everyone. I'm pulling this event together, and what you're seeing here is some in-store shots from my last exhibition at Cubits Gallery. Called Archival Sensoria, and the exhibition was curated by Languid Hands. So this quick and dirty presentation is built around 3 provocations, and I will be talking mainly about my archival practice. So my first provocation is this: a Black and social material and cultural history rarely includes the LGBT experience and the wider LGBT community, including its archival practices, rarely includes a Black experience. And the times that I've seen exhibitions over the decades on the national stage, it then rarely includes Black and brown people as well. And also then what then is then missing from a lot of these conversations is how we refuse to talk about pleasure. So then for me, what is missing is a more nuanced approach to the archive and to how we curate exhibitions. And so in 2005, I co-founded the Ruckus Black LGBT Archive along with Topher Campbell. And I think that it's paramount that I'm self-archiving, collecting, preserving, and telling our stories, creating our projects starts from our unique vantage point. And so basically, I think that the archive is central to all of that. And my second provocation is that while it's important to archive, I think it's also important to unarchive as well. So I actually remember a conversation by Raju Rage at the One Night Gallery, probably about 5 years ago, and Raju came up with this word, unarchiving. So I like this beautiful tension between, yes, we have to archive, and also at the same time question what we are mean by this term called the archive. And so for me, it's a word that is like I'm banded around, and then there is an assumption made that we roughly have the same kind of meaning around this word. And so when I use the word archive, I'm using the word in the sense of I'm something that houses memories, something that holds memories and experiences. And then in terms of those memories and experience, how then do we then bring in conversation around the senses and sensation? In fact, I would go as far to say, how do we talk about the erotics of the archive, the erotics of our practices? And this builds on the work of Audre Lorde, who says that the erotic is not only a question of what we do, it is how fully we are aware in the doing. And the key word there is doing. From here, in terms of I'm thinking about the archive and the erotic and senses and sensation. And there is a question I've been thinking about over the last few years around what if we only spoke about Black queer histories in terms of smells, not the visual, but smells. What if we spoke about Black queer histories in terms of taste and taste only? What would those histories kind of taste like? What then about touch and texture and sonic? What would a soundtrack sound like in terms of a Black queer archival practice? And I had a soundtrack made as part of this exhibition, and the sounds were mainly dance music and club music from your Black gay nightclubs from the late 80s and 90s. And sadly, a lot of those clubs are now gone, and then those sites of memories have now been lost. And then sometimes I go into the archive and then I look for something, and then actually I then end up somewhere else in the archive. So then actually, if I'm then attuned to the archive, I think that the archive also whisper to us as well. Far too often, our Black and brown and queer experiences, our archival practice, our artworks is then looked through the lens of the social public. And that means that other parts of our complex experiences are then sidelined. And so, and to me, then what then is then sidelined usually is questions around pleasure and erotic and joy, ideas around archival pleasure. And so for me, when I touch the archive and when I touch those, and these are contact sheets that you can see, when I touch, let's say, the flyer from the Black Gay Men's Conference, that flyer also touches me. So that then means, and then we then get into questions of intimacy. So then I think that a lot of the work around kind of a archival practice, a lot of the rich and amazing work actually excludes questions around our material body and agency. If we refocus some of the conversations around the senses and sensations and then use that as a bridge to have other kinds of conversations, would our practice shift in some shape or some form? And I'm thinking around, as I said earlier, if the archive is something that holds memories, that means that the archive is not just a space or a place that you can go to. It is that I am also saying that the Black queer, the Black, brown and queer body is the archive, is because every part of our body, parts of the body, flesh and skin, holds memories. That the means then, and we have to then rethink how we talk about the archive as not being over there somewhere. And the archive is here and right now. After my final point is, I think that if we had a more nuanced, sensuous approach to our archival practice, it doesn't mean that we forget what's happening in terms of the social and cultural world. I'm saying actually, and also at the same time, there's these other kind of conversations that I think that we need to have around our practices into how do we embody the archive? How do we inhabit our work as archivists and curators through all of the senses and sensation? And that's where I'm going to end my 3 kind of provocations. So thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm presenting today with Huda, and we've split our presentation into 2 parts. I'll be giving an overview of UMC and kind of demonstrating that expanded field that Paul was talking about. And then Huda will be focusing more on curating and archives. UMC, which stands for One of My Kind, is a zine and an art collective. It was started in 2012 by myself, Rose Nordin and Saba Khan. I used to sell my zines at zine fairs with Saba, and we met Rose at the London Zine Symposium, and then we met her again at like a really obscure little zine fair, I think in Harrow. And Rose is Muslim too, and we started talking about making a zine together. And Rose had this idea about making a zine about significant Muslim women throughout history. And that sounded really great to me and Saba, but we really quickly realized that we didn't know about history and it would take too long to find out. So we changed tack and started working on a zine about women, art and activism. The core team is currently made of me, Rose and Hiba Lamara, who's been with us since 2013. And there's a much broader group involved in the collective who dip in and out whenever it's relevant or helpful for them. And Huda has been with us since the beginning and has worked on lots of different projects with us. So it's a very visual zine. Each issue has a different creative theme that we kind of expect people to make new work in response to. And UMC came about at a time when Muslims and Islam-related content was all over mainstream media. It was mostly very negative, and the topics Muslims were invited to talk about or respond to were very narrow and prescriptive. We recognized that this discourse was not about to change anytime soon or in our favor, and we wanted to channel our energies into creating a nurturing space where we were able to create new work, share ideas, and really listen to each other. At the same time, we were very tuned into like girl zine culture. Zine culture in general was seeing a revival. And this zine, Girls Get Busy, was quite popular. We used to follow it on Tumblr. We noticed that there were loads of people on Tumblr and everyone seemed to be a curator. They were building their identities of resharing and reblogging content instead of creating their own. There was a lot of nostalgia related content, so we were keen to make something new that took up space in the real world and wouldn't just get buried in a blog. Quite early on, we made a manifesto so we could all be on the same page. We saw ourselves as being informed by and trying to continue a tradition of independent and radical publishing. We were inspired by collectives like See Red Women's Workshop. Our manifesto is on our website if anybody wants to read it properly. So See Red Women's Workshop, whose work we came across at the ICA, were a collective feminist silk screen printing workshop. They operated in the 70s and 80s, and we loved their work. It was so powerful, beautiful, and funny. Their ethos of collective working was very inspiring. They spoke directly to people, and we could see that their work was more effective because of this. They didn't speak through institutions. We were also inspired by independent radical Black publishing in Britain and John LaRose. I say we, but this is something that Huda, Arwa, Abu Rawa, and Hiba Lamara were a lot more knowledgeable about. The collective is a site of ongoing mutual learning. Yeah, so this is a video that Arwa and Hiba made together about New Beacon Books, and it's somewhere that Hiba used to volunteer at. And the previous slide, which I wasn't looking at, the previous slide was, we really liked See Red Women's Workshop like a lot, and we got in contact with them after meeting them at the Feminist Library, and we interviewed them for one of the issues. And then later on, when we ran a festival, we spoke to them and we got their posters in an exhibition that we curated. In 2015, we were invited to put on a show at IHRC, which is the Islamic Human Rights Commission. We were operating in the backdrop of prevent and anti-terror legislation. Was something that was affecting our community a lot and a lot of people around us. I guess we were always operating and are still operating with this backdrop of surveillance. Yeah, and maybe that's also a reason why we haven't been so keen to pursue our work primarily through institutions, why we didn't see that as a primary ground for working in, because we would just see that as a broader part of that. We used the show to explore more positive visions of the future, inviting other artists to contribute, creating new publications, an audio piece, and exhibiting a collection of radical zines. And I'll also just add that none of us really saw ourselves as curators in the academic or proper art world sense. We just put shows together based on what we thought was important, what we wanted people to see, and as an act of trying to, a lot of the work that we did was about living art as a way of improving life and creating a culture and a community around. And I guess that's another reason why we weren't really motivated to work through institutions, not that they wanted us at the beginning, but because we didn't see them as sites of living art. This is a publication that we made for that exhibition. It's called Intifada Milk. And it's about a small village in Palestine that tried to organize against the occupation. Okay, so as you can imagine, we didn't make any money from UMC. So we set up a studio called Studio UMC, and that's when we started working with institutions on publications. We had put UMC together, which acted as a really great portfolio. And we knew that our base would be outside institutions, but we were now able to kind of work with them to maybe embark on projects that needed budgets. And this is a publication we made with Bookworks. It's about the past, present, and future of libraries. So I guess this is one way that we were working with archives. It was also really nice because we were able to choose the subject that we wanted to work on. It wasn't really to do with Islam, but because with the zine, we were mainly showcasing other people's work. It was really nice to write and make artwork for this one. We went abroad for a project looking at independent publishing in Malaysia. There was a lot written about publishing in cities like London, Berlin, New York, but there was relatively little information about anything happening in like Asia and Africa. And we had friends in Malaysia, so it seemed like a good place to do a project. And that's the first time we learned about Arts Council funding. We also started doing workshops at galleries, and we found that that was an easy way of kind of generating some income for UMC. And a bit later on, I mean, our work in education has continued, and actually I trained as a teacher a bit later, but this is a project we did with South London Gallery, working with a group of children over the course of a year, and they set up their own printing press called Big Family Press, and it's still going on, and we actually have moved the entire press into Rabbits Road Press. So I guess we're always trying to make projects that we can draw into our world. We're really interested in the whole self-publishing ecosystem. So when we were approached with a space in East London, we decided that we want to turn it into a printing press. I guess this allowed us to create, it allowed us to have access to machinery that we wouldn't otherwise have, because risograph printers are quite expensive. But it also allowed us to take a step back and not be gatekeepers of the content the way we were with UMC. It was like anybody can come and print their own work. This is just a picture of how the press works. It was open, when it first started, it was open once a week for open access, and anyone could come in and we would give them an induction, and then they could come back any other Wednesday and use the space as a classroom. It was really, for me and Rose, I had done foundation and Rose had done a degree, but it was really trying to bring out the things that we loved the most about art school, we found the most valuable, and that was a creative community and having access to equipment. And this is when we went to the Museum of London to do an event with a printing press. So talking about that whole self-publishing ecosystem, we co-organized DIY cultures with Hamja Hassan and Helena Wee for 5 years in Rich Mix, London. It was a day festival with about 80 exhibitors with different stalls, And I guess a lot of the zine fairs that we had been to were quite apolitical. And with this one, we really wanted to explore the intersections between art and activism and how art was living around and the other ways it intersects with different communities who we were in connection with. So anybody who wanted to be at the fair could be at the fair. We had a communal table for people who didn't get a table, and they could just drop their zines off in the morning. And there was a commission to make that, which hopefully explains the MOPs. These are just some flyers I made. I guess because I got into doing this organizational role, I just insisted on designing the flyers every year. And as the festival went on, we were granted more and more space within the Rich Mix. So it expanded to a lot more venues across the Rich Mix, and also a 3-week exhibition, which we ran. And we were able to involve a lot of the other people who we were working alongside, many of whom were not like art people, but whose work was really interesting and we thought it's really important. And I'll just whiz through these, but I thought I'd include a little bit about personal practice and how it intersects with collaborative working. So I developed an art practice alongside UNC, and it was very much informed and enriched by collaborative working. So this is just some work I did for my MA, where I was looking at Victoria Britain's book Shadow Lives, which was talking about how women had been affected by anti-terror legislation. So women whose husbands or sons or fathers were suffering under these anti-terrorism measures. So the stories were kind of already out there. So I just put some images together that link back to it, so it could be in one space. And then one thing that emerged in this book was the new, very unusual routines that had emerged for some of the women. So I made a series of animated GIFs, and this one was of a woman who was just always changing the channel, trying to find out news about her husband because she had no other way of finding out. This is just some other personal work, and I always try to share this with students and tell them that working collaboratively, it might seem that it sets your career back or that you won't be able to find your own voice, but only through working collaboratively have I gained lots of new skills and had the energy or idea to pursue different research interests. And this was a show that I did at Eastside in 2019. Yeah, and that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Sophie, thank you so much. This is such a beautiful presentation. Sophie's already introduced me. My name is Huda Khaira. I am an independent artist and researcher, and I'm a part of many collectives, including UNC, and including one that I'll be talking a little bit more about, another collective called Thicker Black Lines. And I think the reason why I want to bring in sort of the multiplicities here is to really to answer to the theme of today's round table, which is to look at Black genealogies in response to curating and the archive. And so I'll hopefully speak for about 7 minutes, but I want to first unpack what we're talking about when we talk about Blackness, what we're talking about in terms of genealogies, as in influences and sort of where narratives sort of arrive from or influenced by, and also think about the archive as not only as a source of inspiration, but also as a source of conflict, and why thinking about the subjectivity, which is to say the position of Black peoples, and I'll sort of outline what I mean there, makes that relationship with the archive very difficult. And I think Sophie and Ajamu both hinted at this when they shared their practice of actually archive making, I would argue, in the case of Ajamu and Sophia, that they're not going into an already available space that records a narrative that is generative for their purposes today, but rather recalling from places that wouldn't be sometimes not understood as a part of the archive, the actual body, our embodied experiences, or in the case of UNC, arguably creating an archive in commissioning new works. So I want to speak first about this term Black. As Paul spoke about in my biography, my art practice focuses on the experiences of Black peoples globally. And I understand Black as being those people of the African diaspora. I recognize that, however, this conference has been looking at a specific social time in Britain, which understood Black as being a term to think about basically people from the empire, colonized people, people of what we would perhaps in our today's parlance name people of color. And there is sort of a debate and arguments around there. And if you're interested in having those kind of conversations, I'm happy to engage in. But in terms of where this talk is going, I'm speaking specifically of the experience of people of the African diaspora. And I use this term because we are looking at Black, but in relation to Britain and relation to British Art Network, and the ways in which that Blackness arguably doesn't operate as an identity that we name, although it is, I name myself Black, is also reflective of the structure of power and of a division of peoples, a division of humanity. Paul sort of rightly spoke about the experiences and the motivations of artists and curators that have been examined throughout these sessions, as really speaking to an art establishment, a Britain and a state that denied and constricted the humanities of people who weren't of the normative, which is to say not white, not heteronormative, so on and so forth. And so rather than thinking about those of us who don't fall into that category and sort of name all the different ways that the state doesn't recognize us, I turn the gaze back at the state that requires this, that seeks to name people and formulates an understanding of humanity and of citizenship that means that there are people that fall outside and therefore available to absolute violence. And when I use that term, I'm thinking specifically with the work of artist and professor academic and theorist, Professor Denise Ferreira da Silva, who was at Queen Mary and is now at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So we're thinking about race, or maybe more specifically, raciality as a mode of understanding people and dividing peoples. And those of us who are on the other end of raciality, who have been raced, have responded through our art, through our living, through our activism, through all these different modes. And as Sophie so beautifully put it, UNC has been a vehicle by which the issues that she highlighted, that of the war on terror, of Islamophobia, and so on and so forth, had limited the experiences of many of us that identify as Muslim, or people who identify gendered as female, or those of us who just basically aren't white and who found the world and the art world to be incredibly hostile, to create a space where we could create our work. But the experience of those of us who are raced as Black, as in those of us from the African diaspora, those titles that I just named, sort of Muslim, those are titles that people can name themselves as and be comfortable with that. The word Black comes from a very specific history. It has it's ontological, which is means to say what it is to be. It stems from from slavery and from the enslavement of African peoples. And the term Black has always been a political term, because those of us who are from Africa were named other words. And those reclaiming those namings and naming ourselves as Black has been a direct response to that world that was created, arguably this beginning of modernity, or in sort of thinking about this through the terms of sort of Latin American theorists, the coloniality of power, that creation of the enslaved peoples and that division of humanity, who was able to be enslaved and who was understood to be free. And there's a gradient of subjectivity, which is to say who is human in that. And so when we use this word Black as a cover term for many different people who are positioned in the world, it does a disservice. It does a disservice because it closes off what certain conversations that we can have. And the beauty of UNC has been that it doesn't seek to homogenize all those that are in its covers. It has sort of this open call, as it were, but it's one that's centers the stories of marginalized people, recognizing that marginalizing is not inherent in ourselves and our identity, but rather in society that identifies us as such. And so when I'm speaking about Blackness, because I specifically named the experience of African diaspora, I am naming a history, and I'm locating the world that history sort of bears from. And so I think this really helps us think about then the archive, because how do you archive? How do you record and remember the stories of people who are seen as outside of citizenship, but really what we're saying is outside of humanity, this story of European modernity, of slavery and conquest, colonialism, and this so-called post-colonial era, and this era of Commonwealth, so-called Commonwealth, and so-called immigrants and new immigrant stories. That there's the raciality, which is to say the way that the state operates, constantly requires new ways to exclude people in order to affirm what it is to be citizen, what it means to be sort of the proper noun of human, as it were. The archive, and I'm using the work of Professor Saidiya Hartman, is often a site of barbarism. And when we utilize the archive, oftentimes we don't see ourselves in there, or we see a mutant figure of ourselves. And so UMC has always been actually quite reticent with looking back, as it were, and thinking more about how do we create works that we are today. In part of UMC's manifesto, the first line of UMC's manifesto is a reference to the work of John LaRose that Sophie referenced. He was one of the founding members of the Caribbean artist movement here in the UK, and in 1960 created New Beacon Books, and later the George Padmore Institute. All those were in direct response in relation to the barbarism of which African diasporic people experienced, Caribbean people specifically experienced here in the UK, and the vital importance of creating communities and networks that would amplify and would support, and in the purest sense of the word curate, which means to care for a space for those. And so he created a publishing house that would publish Caribbean authors, and he created an archive that would collect those creations of those artists and authors in his community, and a space that would keep it safe, in recognition that the regular arms of the British art world were not safe places for the stories of Caribbean peoples and Black peoples in general. And it's this knowledge, this clear knowledge that from 1960s, that publishing, and the quote is that publishing implies a validation of the South. So we're not waiting for other people to authorize our stories, we authorize ourselves. And that's the reason why New Beacon Books was created. This is, I think that the influence of the Caribbean artist movement and its longevity, and there's so many different places in which this movement has sort of been generative from the 60s onwards, has been really a key source for UMC. And we were asked sort of, were UMC influenced by artists in the 1980s? And to be quite honest, and I think Sophie will speak more about this in the roundtable, not particularly. However, myself as a Black woman, I was incredibly influenced by artists in the 1980s, and particularly the works of people like Lorena Hamid. And so I spoke a little bit about an art collective that I am also a part of called Thicker Black Lines, which is really a direct response to some of the questions that this conference is asking, and has been asking, which is, what are the legacies of Black British curating, Black British art? How are people today accessing and utilizing the archive of really this very generative time where there was many exhibitions, books that were created. What is the legacy of that? And this term genealogy, I always enjoy this term because, well, I think about Foucault and his work, but also I think more generally about this concept of relationality, which is when we think about genealogy, think about sort of roots and this idea of where do things come from and of relation. The big issue that our people of the African diaspora experience, and when I speak about the experiences of people of the African diaspora, I by no means say that these are unique to people of the African diaspora, but rather I am naming a history that the world is implicated and responding to, which is that sort of the ontological shift of what it is to be human, what it is to be a person, and the modernity, you know, that comes from there, sort of the Enlightenment project, and which the arts was absolutely crucial in creating. So the conflict that there are constant cycles where Black people are organizing and creating works together, and then that work seems to disappear. And then again, people sort of re-emerge and they create new things, and you realize those things were already created from before. And this inability, and I use that word with caution, to hold narratives, I would say arguably this is the structure of modernity, that it requires this constant stealing away, taking away of stories, this kind of this newness all over again. And this is the function of power, what is to remember, what is forgotten. And that is also, specifically, it's done through violence. And it's done through violence of taking away people, if we think about the body as being an archive. And Sophie sort of made an outline of the timeline that UNC has came through. There was, so 2012 was the first issue. So that's a year after the uprisings in the UK and across London and across the UK. This was the sort of recognition of not only the war on terror, but also the murder of Mark Duggan, and the increase in tuition fees and the cuts that were taking place in social welfare, and how those impacted people along very specific racial lines, and how arguably we are still living with the implications today. There's also a time of sort of the nascent movements of Black Lives Matter. And within this time, UNC has been a vehicle, a space where we thought about all these different things that were happening together. The drone bombings in Pakistan and the increased militarization across the world, and understanding that increased militarization in places like Ferguson, Missouri, and making those links between what kind of state and the state apparatus and how they impact people of color, and but specifically how understanding things through the experiences of African diaspora and Black peoples, and through that world that slavery created, how that has been able to make us make sense of our lives today. So this kind of genealogy and relationality, but understanding how that's always, I know I'm making this point, you can pull me up on this in the question and answer, very difficult when we're thinking about Black people's experiences. So all that to say, there's a lot of sort of things that I put in there, and I'm really hoping that in our roundtable and question and answer, we can pull apart those things. But yeah, if I want to leave you with anything, it's first understanding that how we frame Blackness frames how we ask the questions about Blackness, and thinking about the archive in, as Ajamu said, in very nuanced terms, but also recognizing the archive as a site of violence itself. And then what's done, or what can be, how we can think when we start thinking about creating work today and our archive of ourselves today. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to hearing more from you later.
Great, thank you everyone so far. So good to be in such amazing company, and definitely Ajamu and one of my kind are practitioners who definitely look across to have these conversations. So it's great to be able to do that and have the space to do that here today. So yeah, I'm going to be try and be to the point. I know 10 minutes is quite difficult to kind of to summarize a lot of what we're doing. I'm going to speak to 3 projects that are collective practices. But just to kind of first to state that my multidisciplinary approach is a direct result of the kind of genealogies that I have been a part of, the socializations of community networks, specific ones that I've been a part of, which are predominantly punk, queer, trans, people of color communities. And also kind of within trans trans and feminist organizing. So I guess less to do with kind of conventional art school and institutional settings, although I do kind of circulate in those spaces. A lot of activity has been outside of those. And yeah, for me, that I guess that kind of frees up this relationship to hegemony and allows less restrictive kind of ways to practice. So yeah, in 2013, I co-formed a collective called Collective Creativity. The reason why it's called Collective Creativity was more because it was not really a name for who we were. It was about our activity and what we were coming together to do. And we wanted to basically reach out to others like us who were struggling with art school education. So the collective is myself and was kind of co-formed with Evan Ifakoya, and then later on Rudy Lowe and Raisa Kabir joined. We are kind of a group of 4 core organizers within the collective, although it was always kind of broader. We had roundtables, as you saw from the first slide. We had these meetups unofficially at the Tate. They didn't know we were there. And we're having these kind of roundtables, speaking about kind of our creativity. So the collective was really formed. It was a group of us, of queer, trans, intersex people of color artists who are based in London. And we've been collaborating since 2013, trying to create radical grassroots space for cutie block creatives to interrogate the politics of art in relation to queer identity, institutional racism, and anti-colonialism. And we were really kind of dedicated to creating that space for the conversations that challenge institutional racism and white supremacy within a cultural framework. So we came together, and actually it was just kind of informally, through community that we kind of knew each other. And we were all kind of undergoing some form of kind of art education and just being disenfranchised, not learning, when we speak about the archive and not having that kind of link to, or not in depth or not in nuance, as we keep mentioning, kind of this thing about nuance and depth around the genealogies that came before us, and specifically around kind of Black and South Asian artists. So the collective is formed of, a mix of Black and South Asian creative practitioners. And we were really interested in kind of looking to what came before us, and what we felt was lacking in our educations. So we were really inspired by the Black Arts movement. We basically started in the Stuart Hall Library, and that's kind of where we embarked this research onto kind of what took place in the Black Arts movement before us. And people like Rashida Areen, who were quite critical in agitating and quite radical. And we saw the Black Arts movement. We weren't really invested in kind of, I guess, this idea of political blackness, but we were interested in the activity that was happening at that time, and kind of with all the conflicts, with all the successes and failures, and all of that. So that site being a productive site to have these conversations. And we did have roundtables at our sessions. It allowed us to actually come into contact with a lot of those artists who were practicing, such as Keith Piper, Sonia Boyce. We also kind of met up with Lubaina Hamid. We went up to see her archive, the Making Histories archive. We were heavily influenced by, the Ruckus archive and what Jamu and Tofo had kind of put together in terms of then looking at kind of, looking at Black and South Asian artists, but then also kind of within that queerness, gender and sexuality as well. So yeah, these were kind of the activity that we kind of underwent as a collective was really around doing this research. There you can see us sitting on the table there doing our research, but also having these roundtables discussing these key issues around legacy, what came before us. And so, yeah, we met with Labena, who gave us some really good guidance and awareness and insight into, different way. I mean, the archive that she has up there in Preston is an incredible archive in terms of what we were looking to, and rather than kind of like these very conventional conservative archives that kind of seek to categorize it, kind of, we were looking to work with something different. So I guess a lot of the activity, I think Ajami mentioned earlier, was really around unarchiving, kind of having this relationship to the archive, activating it, having these conversations, you know, IRL. It was at the time where we could do that back then, but also through the materials as well that we were finding in the archives. And what we found really useful were things like, you know, the letters that Labena Hamid and Rashida Reen kind of really publicized about the conversations that we're having within this kind of white hegemonic art world. So yeah, those are the things that kind of really inspired us. We put together a publication, Surviving the Art School, and it's an Artists of Colour toolkit. So we were really kind of seeking to produce kind of practical resources that could be used. That kind of blew up, and a lot of kind of collections and art schools and so on kind of were very interested in it. We kind of workshopped this. We produced it in collaboration with Nottingham Contemporary, with Jana Graham. We kind of joined another kind of collective, I guess, as part of another project called Another Roadmap, which is a transnational global project around decolonizing arts. And we kind of joined with Jana Graham around that. So that was another kind of activity that we were doing, kind of moving away from, I guess, the UK context, but kind of globally what's happening around the world. So I'll kind of leave that at that. There's a lot of activity that happened with the collective. There's a lot more we can kind of speak to on that, but we can maybe come back to some of these questions. But really thinking about the archive in a kind of a radical way, in kind of using the archive also as a kind of a learning resource and a tool. And so the next kind of project that I'm going to speak about is kind of built off the collective activity that we did with Collective Creativity, and a kind of a project of mine, which is called Undervalued Energetic Economy. So yeah, again, thinking through kind of, you know, coming to head with a lot of what's happening with kind of art institutionalization and a lot of kind of institutional racism and problems around the Eurocentricity of what we were facing and coming up against. We've been quite vocal and quite verbal in going to various art events and panels and so on, and kind of asking a lot of questions, critical questions. I think we were quite young and naive and very kind of full of energy to be quite critical, along with a lot of other collectives who were doing so at the time, and not being really taken quite seriously. But then through the trajectory of collective organizing, we were started to be listened to, which was interesting as well in itself. So Undervalued Energetic Economy was, building on that. It was a kind of a installation, an archive, kind of like a living archive, and a learning resource. I don't really, I guess, define it, or I'm not interested in kind of defining what it is, but it works in multiple ways. If we can go a bit slower with the slideshow as well, that'd be great. So yeah, it was really kind of, I was inspired by, I guess, my socialization in a lot of community space and a lot of kind of activist networks that I'd come up in the early 2000s. And yeah, feeling like a lot of spaces had closed, community spaces had closed, queer and trans spaces had closed. Ajami was speaking about all these clubs that we would, you know, kind of have community and come together. A lot of those spaces kind of closing. And really thinking about what kind of economies took place in those spaces, kind of around this energetic economy. It's also a term inspired by Alexis Pauline Gums, who I had also been in conversation with through kind of being part of different networks across transnationally as well. So yeah, this project was really about, it was also inspired by the Kitchen Table Press. So I'm very interested in printed matter, in self-published materials. I come from that kind of zine culture that Sophia kind of spoke to and kind of shared with us as well. And yeah, so that was kind of really looking to the origins of, kind of, you know, zine culture and how kind of zine culture was also kind of, kind of producing this kind of political way around kind of having kitchen table conversations with each other. The Kitchen Table Press was a group of Black and women of color feminists who came together across kitchen tables to have conversations around white feminism and their place within that, kind of against it, I guess. So I decided to create this map, which takes the form of a tablecloth to kind of, I guess, symbolize that conversation. It kind of raises the entanglements between art, activism, and academia, which are kind of areas that I kind of I kind of am situated within, and kind of exposing the problems within them and posing strategies. And then alongside that is kind of a ephemera that kind of is supporting resources such as self-published materials. Kind of a lot of them are kind of rare materials, or things that would fall outside of the archive, wouldn't be part of kind of the conventional archive, and have this critical voice around the questions that we're asking today. And the project also kind of was this platform to make those connections. So you see in the map, there's all these arrows that kind of also, you know, some of them do actually point to things, but some of them just signify this connection that we have with each other and across movements and across kind of coalitions, you know, as well, that I feel are really important, especially when we talk about kind of Blackness as well, these kind of coalitions that formed, and how we kind of work together. So the resources are obviously, you know, a group, are multiple kind of contributions from multiple creative practitioners. So this project was around kind of, I guess, decentering the idea of the solo artist, but showing, really kind of visibly showing that there's all these connections that come to be, that we're not kind of individual and alone in our kind of creations or successes. And also, you know, this map was also about having these conversations, right, about accountability, about just having these discussions. So this kind of project took a form of kind of workshops, events, exhibitions. Usually the exhibitions had some sort of site-specific focus, because I'm not really interested in just it being part of an exhibition for no reason. So they kind of related to the site that they were on, whether that's a local community, or where it was situated. And now this is being built as a kind of a learning resource, so something that schools and community groups and individuals could use as a learning resource. So that kind of follows on from the collective, where we were thinking about kind of creating, this kind of pedagogy based on our lived experiences and those that came before us, that we've been really impacted by and more interested in a way. I mean, as interested in as with the artworks that were produced, right? So what goes behind the scenes, what happens. And then the last project is the Recipes for Resistance, just to kind of bring it up to date. This is a project that I am involved in terms of looking at the politics of food and its relationship to migration and diaspora. So again, it's a self-published material. It's a nice Riso printed zine, I guess. And yeah, the project was something that I wanted to do, I guess, in relationship to this conversation we're having around Blackness and the positionality of South Asian identity and experience within that. I felt like there is a lot around kind of a sharing and a legacy around Blackness and Black communities that I feel was kind of lacking within the South Asian context, especially when we're thinking about the Black Arts movement and speaking to certain practitioners around kind of the failures around that passing on of knowledge and community. I felt like there were conversations that wanted to have specifically within the South Asian context around things like caste, things around kind of gender and queerness, ethnicity and religion, but also conservatism and respectability. But yeah, just to kind of have a deeper, more nuanced conversation within the South Asian diaspora, that's within the UK, but also outside of that, about the politics of food and migration. So kind of thinking through food beyond just ingredients, but also, how things come to be, right? So the ingredients that create a recipe. So, I mean, this did take the form of an exhibition. There was an exhibition that took place, but it was very much homed or housed within a community space that was used by local communities to Birmingham, to Balsall Heath, a predominantly very mixed community of a lot of people of colour. So it's a space that's not just an art gallery, it is a community space. People come there and cook, people come there and pray. There was kind of artist studios there as well, and I was interested in that site of and how that kind of those spaces kind of sit with each other. And the publication kind of reached or migrated kind of globally. It allowed it to kind of an artwork to go into people's homes, into personal spaces, to the domestic space, which is kind of what the project is also about, looking kind of at the domestic space, looking at lived experience, looking at our lives. I also wanted to kind of reach outside of the art world. I felt like I felt like a lot of conversation is limited by being just in the art world, and there's a lot more that can happen, when we kind of connect these voices and these struggles. And that's something that I have always been a part of as an activist, I guess, in previous things that I've been involved in. I mean, the project's growing, it continues to grow. There's also a podcast looking, a lot at kind of the impact of colonialism and British imperial legacy, because that's also a really big factor within this. But thinking through South Asian identity, I guess, as the middle of the colonial sandwich, as Aftabra speaks about, and kind of unpacking that. So I'll kind of leave it with that. I wanted to read a quote out because I think it really speaks to, this is a quote that kind of inspired Recipes for Resistance. It's by Alma Lavan, who is a Black queer writer, for mostly kind of science fiction writer in the US. Just the other day, I was reading that resilience is an ecology more than it is an individual trait or possession. If so, dreaming together can weave the context for our healing. That is a container, an atmosphere, a potentiality, not transcendence. In fact, I'm not sure how much we're breaking free of personal and collective trauma as much as we're brewing adaptogens, recipes for resistance, a kiss and a fist.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If can I ask Sophia, Huda, and Jamu to great, to come back in. Great. Well, I had a really boring question, I realize now, given listening to the range and the materialities and the depth and the incredible range of practices we talked about. And I kind of realized that I was, guilty of shoehorning you all into a kind of my conceptual framework, which is the very thing I'm trying to deconstruct in curating, right? And what I want to start with actually is something that emerged, I think it came out of all of the discussions, which is this idea of archiving and unarchiving. This kind of unarchive. What does it mean to unarchive? Because I have been working with, and I've written a little bit about the idea of uncurating. And I wanted to explore that. I wanted to kind of really just maybe start with, or before I say that, before I give the question, I mean, some of the themes that came across, and they were really beautiful presentations, every one of you, thank you so much. What really struck me were questions of self-organization, self-instituting, publishing, kind of not being focused all the time about integration and going into the, do you know what I mean, being accepted and being part of the system. We want to get part, it's like, let's do our own thing, let's organize our thing, let's be collective, let's work together. So this idea of collectivity, togetherness, and we talked before about the word love, and let's bring the word love into this, love. And living, embodiment, right? That these things came through, lived experience, and also materiality. I think every presentation, the idea of materiality, the actual idea of moving away from certain abstractions that the art world often is in love with. I mean, also, I think there are roles for abstraction, but I mean, the generalized abstraction of racist, patriarchal, heteronormative capitalism, I think in the practices that I think we're presented here, there's an antidote to that. It is a kind of materiality, there's a groundedness that I think is really strong. So let me not go on a boring genealogical question to kind of shoehorn you into say, what are your influences? Let me just start with this question of collectivity, togetherness, love, and living. In other words, which does, as I think Huda mentioned and Sophia mentioned, is related to the etymology of curating as a form of care, right? It's about care. So can I ask you, because in a way, why I brought you together is to I kind of wanted to think about your practices, or invite you to think about your practice within this notion of the curatorial. But in a way, maybe we need to, as many of you mentioned in terms of unarching, maybe we need to uncurate. Maybe this curating concept is actually redundant in many respects. Anyway, just an open question. And Ajamu, do you want to maybe perhaps start off and address that?
I don't think that the term is redundant. I think that we need other ways to try and think about things that's not fixed and rigid. And for me, it's always about it's not just about the physical archive, but it's about the conceptual archive as well. And then actually, how do we think around this thing called the archive? And then key to that is that notions around the archive and its materiality has got to have a conversation around sensuousness. If not, then once again, we get locked into this loop about always talking about our work in terms of the social publics, and so on. Basically, we then get into the content of the archive, but not about how we make the archive. Yeah, and so really, I think for me, it's an around. I would talk about the making and process. Not that those things are separate, but I think that there is a over determination of one than the other, and that's how I think kind of Black and brown and queer artistic practice is also locked into that narrative, and which means that the work is then pulled into sociology, it's then pulled into education, and then what is then missing is how we make and construct these things. That means then that the making and constructing, the body is front and center.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Sophia, I was really, thank you, Jamu. I was really struck in terms of the range of practices you described that does, and also the materiality of that. I mean, risographic printing, and I really learned about it through researching your practices, is a very material, it's a very kind of material, textual form, and the kind of workshops that you do, the commissioning you do, which would definitely fit into notions of the curatorial. But I guess I was struck by when you said, everyone seemed, when you were talking about the ecology in which many of these practices, you said everyone seemed to be a curator. Everyone was, producing lots of stuff. And I just wondered how the curatorial sits with, your practice, as an artist, as someone that's involved in, in these activities. And I was really struck actually by not only materiality, but by, and I think it runs through all of the presentations, this sense of, doing our own thing, creating our own spaces. That was really strong, I think, in all of them. Anyway, sorry, I'll shut up. Sophia.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to come to your question about working collectively. A lot of the work that we were doing, and the reason for doing it, was about creating an art world and making a creative community, which needs more than one person to do. And the one person individual route was very much about displaying and presenting what you've made. And we were not interested in that. We were interested in learning, discovering, creating. And that's why terms like curating, or the terms that the professional art world use, they felt very contained and narrow. They weren't talking to the whole world. It was talking to an art world, which from the get-go was a bit boring. It was just quite a small audience. It wasn't really the kind of people who we were, you know, it wasn't the world that we were part of, or we didn't really see what the benefit was of being part of that world. Like, we can read books and not be in that world. We can learn and not have to always report back. And I think there was a real sense of, we don't really want to report back to anyone because this is going to be a genuine inquiry. And I think the way we worked through different materials or ideas, it was just our way of responding to like a broadening imagination. Like, how does this inspire us to have bigger vision or a different vision? And we were open to that in a way that I don't think we could have been if we'd gone down a very professional route, or even if we saw our work as professional. We didn't necessarily do that. We saw, it was almost like an expanded hobby more than a job. Yeah.
You know, that really kind of resonates with me, because I think one of the problems with contemporary art generally, and with the art world, and increasingly art schools, is that there's an over professionalization, right? You know, training is about being a professional artist, professional curator, but there is, as you say, the kind of, yeah, there's a kind of craft to in making, and materiality to curating is important. Huda, I was, I mean, your presentation had so many things that I could pick up on, but I wanted to just pick up on going back to this question of the archive and the unarchived. And you mentioned about the archive as a site of barbarism in some respects, and that has always been reticent about the idea of looking back, right? It's about the focus on today. And I wanted to maybe just say a bit more about how you curate from the archive, how you work with the archive in terms of making what you do public.
Yeah, no, thank you. A few years ago, we did a conference about the failure of the archive, where lots of these things sort of came out. And ostensibly, the archive when we're looking at the archive, we think most of these archives were created by the state, whether it be sort of a library, a public library, or sort of something like the British Museum, or any sort of art school spaces, and they have a specific logic. And the logic of those has been, you know, has been a violent one, has been violent against us. So when we see ourselves in those spaces, we see ourselves as the native, as the one that is the object, literally objectified in there. The project that I'm doing, the Somali Museum, looks at the history of human zoos and how peoples from Somalia were taken into these spaces. We're thinking about stolen artifacts. We are in those spaces then with much like Sophie was speaking about with the art school, we understand already they're combative spaces. They're not spaces for us that are amenable to us. And so we are very, also we go into those spaces combatively, and with a discernment that we're not looking, much, I think more like a, I'm going to use a term, but I don't think it's true, but sort of things find us as opposed to we're going to those spaces. And in hindsight, you can think, oh, that's archival practice. For example, See Red Collective, we were literally looking through books. We met the people. They, you know, some of the people live literally around the corner from us. We're able to go to their houses and interview them and see them. And so having that kind of living, focusing on a living archive, which is to say, people are always already repositories of stories and ideas, and engaging with people with stories to tell. That has been, I think, the number one way that has looked at the archive, and also being so clear with what the archive misses, because our experience has been like vampires, sort of looking in the mirror and not seeing reflection. And I'm taking that from Black feminists, and my mind's gone blank. But that is that reality is one that we recognize, and so it's a combative one, and it's also one with focusing our story on what there's a reason of that, why that archive is there and what we want to do with that archive. So I think about Sophie's story about women in the war on terror, and the archive of court cases, of gag orders, of you can't report on the things that are happening to people, of the absences. It's that archive, I think, has been very interesting for us, because the absence is as much of the archive as well as the presence there. So yeah, there is a barbarism being in the archive and also the absence of the archive.
Sure, thank you. Raju, it was, the idea of unarchiving was cited by Jamu as, relating to your practice, or that something that you mentioned that inspired him in that sense. Like, can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit in terms of what you meant by that, how that relates to your practice and across these incredible collectives? I remember, by the way, the sessions in the Tate Modern, the Blue Room, or whatever it was called, in the undercommons of the museum, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I spoke a little bit to it, but I think this idea that the art, like Huda just said, there's absence there. There's a colonial violence. There's a kind of an anti-queer kind of categorization, and there's queer people, beyond. I'm talking about queerness as kind of the political. We want to move beyond that kind of categorization, or to maybe also to have agency around how we do that. I think for us, when we were delving into the archives around kind of the Black Arts movement specifically, I guess we were interested in more than what we were finding. And I think what we were finding was very much framed in a specific way, depending on who archived it and what their intentions were. And that became really clear. That became really clear when we looked at Ruckus, for example, compared to what we might find about the Black Arts movement in an art school archive, for example. So I think we realized that we were quick to learn that there was more there that we needed to find. And then luckily, when we had that roundtable session, I think it was based around the failure of the Black Arts movement. It caused a lot of, it was contentious. So I think a lot of people came, and then we actually had people physically in the room that we could have these conversations with. And through having those conversations, I think it was a very tense roundtable actually that we had, but really generative and really productive. We realized that it's not according to what we're finding. That's actually in the official formal archives. There's a lot more to the story, whether there was a Black Arts movement, whether people saw it that way, whether there was already this tension around political Blackness at the time in the 80s and so on. So we realized, and then also through the materials, I think Thin Black Lines that Labaina Hamid put together, that exhibition publication, when I saw that in 2012, the second iteration really changed my life. Like it literally did. And that itself is an archive, right? So I think, being able to have these conversations and being able to kind of unarchive, I think that was the point, is that we needed to kind of dig it out and actually figure out what was actually happening. And that was a privilege to be able to do that. I realize now, and things have changed so much around kind of community space and how we can gather together and come together. I think that's what we meant by the unarchiving. And then we also were really interested in, well, if we want to archive ourselves, a lot of movements that I've been a part of have not been archived. How do we want to go about doing that? And how do we want to activate also these archives that we were coming, in presence with? We realized we wanted to do, more than kind of just look at a piece of paper. We wanted to have, different ways, kind of using video, audio, other mediums that would appeal. We had a Tumblr site, for example, for our collective, where we shared material, where it could be a free source, open source, free source, that could be accessible to people, and so on. So I think there's all these questions that come up around kind of the archive and unarchiving.
Great. There are questions coming through, but before I do that, can I ask one more question to everyone, and just a quick, if you don't mind, just a quick kind of summary. Sorry about that, because we are running out of time, but I was just wanted to come back to the question of exhibition, and ask you, because it's quite clear that exhibition, that all of you are involved in exhibitions, because obviously you're artists, etc., curators. But I mentioned that the history, I mean, Huda mentioned the human zoo. I mean, the history of exhibitionary technology were definitely something that defined us, Black people and brown people, outside of the realm of humanity, and we're very violent, right? So I wondered how in your practices exhibitions sit. Where does it sit in your practices, whether artistic or curatorial? Is it something which is centered? Is it something which is important? Something which is necessary? Or is it something which, you know, perhaps we need to move away from because of new platforms, you know, online, etc. So if you don't mind, just a quick response. Start with Ajamu.
I think for me, exhibitions are key to my practice, is because actually I do love those spaces. And so for me, it's always about I'm moving in between me, the artist, as an individual, and me, the artist, as part of a collective of other people as well. And so really I like to move in between lots of different types of spaces, and the exhibition space is one of those spaces I actually do like. And then because then it means then other kind of audiences could come into that space to have other kinds of conversations. And so I think that we talk about the art world, but I think I want to talk more about the art village and then which ones we are part of. So that once again, I'm exhibitions and those kind of space kind of work for me to show my work. And that's because then in some cases there's some spaces outside of that cannot show my work and they won't show my work. And so then that's the part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Sophia?
I mean, I suppose even the zine, it felt like an exhibition, like every time there was a launch and it was a display of people's work. But I would say exhibitions are really important for deadlines and for forcing ideas out. That's what
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Huda?
I think the voyeurism that we were speaking about is an experience that Black peoples have anyway. I mean, you're an exhibit when you're sitting on the bus, you're an exhibit when you're in a room. I think that there's something to be said about, and so much of our practice, I think all of us have a very interactive conception of the exhibition. It's not just this show, it's also a round table, it's also the opportunity to speak with members of the public that are able to come and engage and have more detailed relationship with your work. I think also there's something to be said about interrupting spaces, but also I think about exhibition like inviting people to your home. So you have this opportunity to create, you know, the container that you, as much as you can, but create a container for your work and have that, and create a home and for visitors to come.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thanks. Arju?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I mean, if I hadn't seen Thin Black Lines, then my life would be very different. So I think for some reasons, you know, it is important to see some exhibitions and see them in institutions that maybe you wouldn't usually, right? But at the same time, I think it's limiting. And I think when I try to curate anything, although I'm not thinking about being a curator when I'm doing it, I'm just kind of trying to make things happen. It's about kind of also thinking, well, who's going to access that space? Who's going to come there? Who do I want to reach? I try to create materials that maybe can extend beyond that and can move beyond the kind of a physical room in a physical space in an art institution, or just thinking, yeah, I think there's just many different ways that we can curate, and I think there are some really exciting examples that exist that go beyond just kind of an exhibition in a one room space. So yeah.
Great. So we were thinking of asking people to switch on their sound, ask the question, but I think that might take too long, sorry. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read some of the questions. Some of them are quite long. So the first question is from Kasalina Maliamu Nabakusa. I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong, Kasalina. Thank you, panelists, for your presentations. I'm interested in the idea of disappearance and recurrence of Black art in archives, the idea of disappearance and recurrence. I found an article about masterpieces that disappeared from a museum in Angola during the 1980s and re-emerged in the global north while looking through archives at the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. This June, I listened to a talk by the art historian Suzanne Bleer from Harvard about the untold inspiration Picasso had from referring to books on African art in the creation of artworks such as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And finally, I recently read about how the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky was inspired in his landmark work, Rite of Spring, by the Fauvist movement, which was influenced in Paris by the appearance of African art. So how has modernity and the possibilities of Black curation been shaped by the disappearance and re-emergences of African art, in your opinion? Great question. Want to start with that?
I love that question. And so much of my art practice, and I think it's been echoes across everybody, is an understanding of embodiment and bodilessness. So when we're thinking about disappearances of art and Black artists and Black the influences and tracing that genealogy, we have to think about the ways in which our current episteme finds it very easy and in fact requires so often violence, death and disappearance of Black peoples. You know, this is why we have these movements like Black Lives Matter. Ajamu, if you think about your contemporaries that came from, that you will come working with, and how many of the people that you work with survive today and are making work today. And all of us can tell about these stories. So there is an availability to absolute violence that Black peoples face. And so that means that they're not able to tell their own stories. And then there is a structure that monetizes that. So Africa is a free-for-all. People of color are available to be sort of like picked ideas, and suddenly you're talking about paisley prints that have nothing to do with Northern Ireland, everything to do with sort of like colonial Raj in Bengal and stealing those ideas, because those people are sort of, to use that Hegelian term, they're transparent, and whereas the European is universal. And we see this like, and this is modernity, like this is what when we really trace like what we think about like modern is conquest and modernity. It was, you know, I don't want to do that because I'm Swahili and Raju as well. So like, look, we have our own East African conversations and Indian Ocean conversations about where modernity starts, like global trade. But like 1492, Columbus comes, you know, invades the New World, steals and takes African peoples, and then a whole new, completely different epoch of global trade and ideas of movement. And yeah, so I take it there, my friend. And that was a beautiful question that you asked, and very prescient. And there's a lot of answers that the art world, and specifically the British art world, have to really think about.
Great. Does anyone else want to quickly come in on that one before I move on to the next one? Okay, I'll move on to the next one. Question from Nicola Anthony. Are there any new networks or working methods you can recommend which are disrupting the system, which still in the arts does not foreground Black or brown voices? In other words, not just waiting for the current networks and systems to continue to change to be representative of society, but shortcutting around this to link to those programs and organizations who seek to foreground diverse voices and those curators, artists who are those diverse voices. So I think that's a question about, are there any new networks and working methods that are disrupting the system in relation to Black and brown voices? Does anyone want to come in on that one?
I can come in.
Sure.
As someone who's been working in a collective for a long time, I would say something that might challenge the norm is friendship as a way of working. Like, friendship has lasted longer than any sort of institutional model that we could have started, and it's completely the skeleton of the way we work. And also that everything isn't for everybody. So there is so much happening for so many people right now, and just because it's not mainstreamed, I don't see that things being mainstreamed is success, because often it gets, we all know, it just gets watered down, or, you know, have to make everyone understand the same thing. It's like, it's really weird way of even thinking that everything is for everyone all the time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other quick responses on that one?
I think just to go off what Sophia said, I think that it is happening. There's a lot. I was just trying to list them, and then I was like, no, because I'm going to leave someone out, and there's just so much. I think there is a lot of that happening, but it's not mainstreamed, as you said. And I think looking away from the mainstream and not seeking validation necessarily, but through the mainstream is important. and to recognize that it's all there. Even the research that we did as a collective, you know, just because it wasn't there doesn't mean it wasn't there. It was just we didn't have, you know, have that to hand. So to kind of acknowledge that. Yeah.
I kind of want to add that I think that we should be careful on how we use the word mainstream, because it also actually there are also Black and queer mainstreams too. And so, again, I think there is always this danger of always kind of I'm using these clunky labels without trying to drill down into those other kind of ways that we can talk about these things. And so actually, I think for me, I get slightly frustrated when it's kind of mainstream versus something else. And then these binary frameworks really is not useful for when we want to have more nuanced and complex conversations of it. And there might be a good starting point, but I don't find these binary frameworks useful. And basically, I think for me, I kind of always come back to what are we doing around the work that we need to do? And that's it. And then that's my starting point, is they're not always starting from there to come back to me or there to come back to us. I'm saying, actually, what is it that we are doing in terms of our making and processing, first and foremost, then always get locked into some of these ideas that are very important conversation, but usually they're taken away from the work and the making of the work. That was my pennies
So
work.
just to say, because that question was asked was about like, where are you seeing these things? And I arguably, because they're not seeing them in the mainstream, which is why that kind of, it may look like a binary, but ostensibly it was a response to the question. And the last point I wanted to make though, is that as Sophie was saying, so many of us come from lots of different social locations. Being able to appreciate and understand each other's social location and your own is the number one way in which you can start making like connections. And friendship is such I think it's for me anyway, that's been the basis of my praxis. It's like how in a real friendship is one that you're able to understand each other, and then from there a curatorial practice, which say a practice of care, is able to establish itself, and that itself is an archive.
Back to love. Yeah, beautiful. A comment.
I don't know. I think that we also make friendships sexually too. I thought once again, we need to kind of not get locked into this beautiful way of creating friendships. We also create friendships via sex and fucking and love making, and community and networks and collectives. I think actually it's these erotic spaces that might have unrequired desire in the mix, create collectives, create these spaces also.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to think about that in relation to the exhibition space, the undercommons of the exhibition. You know, what's repressed sexually, in terms of touch. You mentioned about sensoria, you know, anyway, we could get into that. But we've only got a few minutes left. A quick comment from Amina McConnell in response to that question about networks. She said that Black Curators Collective and Black Curatorial Labs are two new networks that I know of. So quick question from Pauline D'Souza. Hi, Pauline. What also comes out of the discussions is about economic survival for the collectivity and how or where the flexible archive can exist. Can the panel discuss their relationship to the economic and the flexible archive, and then think about how they keep their concept of the archive without being forced to change the concepts? So I guess the relationship with the economic to the archive, and how do you kind of keep that going? I think that was addressed actually in the presentations. I'll start very briefly with Raju. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I'm just reading that again. Sorry, I need to read that again.
Yeah. What also comes out of the discussion is about economic survival for the collectivity, and the flexible archive can exist. I'm not quite sure what Pauline means by that, but can the panel discuss their relationship to the economic and the flexible archive, and then think about how they keep their concept of the archive without being forced to change the concept? So I guess what the impact of the economic in terms of thinking about archives.
Okay, so I mean, I can respond in terms of kind of the undervalued energetic economy, because for me, through that project, I tried to create my own economy through it. So, you know, using it as a learning resource, which would then be paid by institutions and a sliding scale from institutions to community groups to individuals and so on, would allow to feed back into the project to create those connections and nurture those kind of those relationships with those creative practitioners. So I do think a lot about kind of economies. I don't think I've ever operated in a very conventional sense, so I don't really have a good understanding of how these things work conventionally in terms of like the economics of an archive conventionally. So I've always been interested in doing things differently and then figuring out how that can be, I guess, economically viable. I also teach, so, you know, that's part of the work that I then also create an economy and then kind of feeds into creative practice as well. So I think, and I'm always working on a kind of redistribution model as well, trying to get funding for things and allow them to be used for the benefit of more than just myself, maybe a community that I'm involved in or other projects. So I think many of us are constantly thinking or faced with this kind of economic survival and finding ways creatively, even that's a creative process in itself, to do that.
Great, thank you, Raju. Can I have one quick response from someone on that question? Or if not, I'll move on to the last question. Okay, I'll take that as the last question, because I also want to spend, if everyone is okay, we're now 3 minutes to 4, but we might go on for another few minutes, because I want to come back to the panelists to give them the final say. So the last question is from Ashok Mistry. As Black and Brown artists and curators, why do we not talk about disability? It feels as if there's a reluctance to talk about Black, Brown, body, mind, perceived as imperfect. Surely what is seen as disability is at the core of the body as memory. Great question. Raju?
Yeah, I mean, I totally hear that, and I feel I hear what you're saying, but just to recognize that it is happening. I wrote an article called Access, Intimacy and Institutional Ableism that speaks to that. There's a lot of people who kind of, I can, yeah, in the collective, me and Raisa are both disabled, have disabilities, and we speak quite openly about that and have been, we did something recently with Sunil Gupta's show at the Photographers Gallery around speaking to that, especially in kind of in its relationship to the AIDS crisis as well. And what, yeah, so I feel like it's what you're saying is totally true. I think it's left out. I think it's so kind of tied in when we think about, you know, when we think about the crux of colonialism and capitalism. Ableism is so important to that and crucial to that, and how those kind of intersections kind of, yeah, work together. So I think it's something that we should not be overlooking. I feel like I'm in a circle where that's happening, but maybe it's something that's not happening in a mainstream. Yeah.
Sure. Someone else want to address that question?
I think, again, sort of talking about what it is to be human, when we talk about when we take it to that point, then you can see that that story of what it is to be human isn't just about how we are identified under the racial matrix, but how our bodies are understood to be functional under sort of this current episteme, including global capital. So, I mean, there's so many things. I want to be careful and sensitive here, but it's to say that body normativity is not something that's afforded Black peoples anyway. So respectfully, I disagree that maybe talking about specific disabilities, if the questioner wants to say, how come certain artists don't speak about these types of things? But in terms of like the bodiliness issue, I think that that's something that is, I've seen as being, that there isn't a discussion about the perfect Black body. I think that's the opposite. That's not.
Okay, thank you for that. You know, I think we'll unfortunately to round up, that was the last question actually anyway, but so thank you for addressing those. Just in closing, I'd like to maybe just go around individually to just give you the last word. And from my perspective, I mean, I've learned so much today and taken on board. I think some of the things that I've taken on board is that, you know, who needs the mainstream anyway? Number one, we need more love in all its guises. That love encompasses collectivity, etc., etc. We need to create and sustain all ourselves and our stuff and create our own shit, basically. We need to take seriously the concerns around materialities, embodiments, sex, joy, pleasure, and insert those into economies of care. Those are some of the things that I've taken from this, but I'd like to just give you the last word in terms of just, even without forcing curating the curator down you, but just, you know, down your throats. I mean, you know, where do you, what emerges from you in terms of this discussion around the genealogies of Black curating, if at all? So I'll start with Ajamu.
I think we should not lose sight of questions around embodiment and the senses within our practice. And I think some of the conversations should bring back in the senses and pleasure and archival pleasures.
Great, thank you. Sophia?
Perhaps I'm thinking about how can we spread into the time that we're in, instead of thinking about how we will be perceived by future generations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need to occupy the present. Yeah. Huda?
That curation necessitates an ethics, and Black genealogies, if that term is to mean something, that has to be an ethical understanding of what we're talking towards.
Beautiful, thank you so much. Raju?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about how we are always inspired by the other, or what comes before. We're not reinventing the wheel, but how we carry all of that, because it's not all of it is stuff that we do want to carry, or things that we want to do differently, and how we want to kind of make changes and transform, as well as kind of hold what came before, and give acknowledgement and credibility instead of erasing that, and kind of, I guess, a strategy for me has always been collectivity, and how do we do that now in this current pandemic, and what's going on in terms of being isolated and being separated from each other, which is another tool of capitalism as well.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, there's lots of comments coming in about how thoughtful and fascinating and generally beautiful this discussion has been, which I would completely endorse. I'd like to thank Jamu, Huda, Sophia, and Raju for sharing and being generous with your practices with us, and responding so generously to my musings around genealogies of Black curating. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you in various guises, in various forms. Just the last point I would say that this is the final session in the roundtable, the final 3 rounds. I'd like to thank everyone that has been part of this, the fantastic Black and Brown curators, artists, thinkers, theorists, activists that has shared their thoughts with us. The project also has other components which will be archived on the British Art Network website. There'll be interviews and there'll be some films as well to form a package. And this is a longer scale project that I'll be working on, that will have a written component, a published component around this. So I'd like to thank you all again. And thanks everyone for coming today, and take care of yourselves. Thank you.